Come on.
Way back yonder.
Come on.
There were some folks that went to West Africa.
Yeah.
They went over yonder to the Igbo tribe.
All right.
And they cultivated. They got together. Some folks. And they brought them first of all to Savannah.
Come on.
And then them same folks wound up yonder on St. Simon Island. A place they call Dunbar Sound. Come on. St. Simon Island. Well, I tell you what happened. In translation, we got to Igbo. But it was Igbo.
All right.
Listen here. They got on this ship. And when they got to this foreign land, St. Simon Island, Dunbar Sound, they got ready to get off of that ship.
Come on.
And they thought about Mother Africa.
Yes.
To this day, there's a legend talking about these men and these women.
Come on.
When they stepped off the ship, they looked at the ship.
Come on.
They looked at the ocean.
Yes.
And they thought about Mother Africa. And they thought to themselves, ain't gonna be no slave yet.
Come on, yeah.
Joined themselves together, stepped over in the Dunbar Song and drowned themselves.
All right.
To this day, it is called Igbo's Landing on St. Simon Island. It's a few miles from where we live. And we sing this song dedicated to those Africans that they call the Flying Africans, or the Flying Spirits.
All right.
Hi, y'all.
And Miss Marsha, if you will.
Now give me two wings to bear my faith. Now give me two wings to wings.
Yeah.
Bear my feet. Give me two wings to fly away. All the world takes to be on. Now give me two wings to wings. Bear my faith. Now give me two wings to wings. Bear my feet. Now give me two wings to fly away. All the world takes to be on. One glad morning, Jesus wasn't too far. Fly away.
Copyright disclaimer. Under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976, allowances made for fair use for purpose such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statutes that might otherwise be infringing. Father God, Mother God, thank you for everything that you are doing, everything that you have done, and everything that you're about to do. Ancestors, the spiritual council, the Holy Spirit of the living God, we thank you. Today we'll be tackling the misconceptions of Hoodoo. Welcome to Blended Healing. There are so many misconceptions that a lot of us practitioners come across about what Hoodoo is and what it isn't. Let us go through and debunk some of the prevalent myths in order to clear up the confusions about the African American folklore magic system. There are some main misconceptions about the formation or the origins of hoodoo and what the practice consists of. We hear it's the work of the devil, it's witchcraft. Hoodoo and voodoo are the same. Hoodoo is a practice opened to everyone. Misconception number one, it's the work of the devil, witchcraft. No, it's not. This was derived originally from white Protestant Christians who thought hoodoo was the equivalent to the damnation, like witchcraft. Eventually, this belief became heavily internalized once African Americans began to move into the church at the turn of the century. But hoodoo is a belief and a practice that understands life and death, the continuous ebbs of the spirit, and the pulls from nature and its energies to shape and counter physical conditions. Since human life is a part of this adjoining web of the universe, and since everything is stood relationally, it is possible to direct and redirect life events. The conjurer. The conjurer is the mediator that's between these interconnected dimensions and knows how to influence each of them. There is herbal knowledge and the use of plants, which is also a component of conjuring. But the root worker or herbalist is the individual who uses natural herbs and or roots to cure physical ailments. Think of a conjurer as using their power, the ancestors, the incantations, the help of objects such as mojo bags and other material forces to counter or produce negative life events. And the root worker as someone who uses their natural knowledge of these natural forces to cure physical ailments. Of course, the role of these practitioners and these concoctions used to cure ailments commonly cross paths. When our enslaved ancestors was on the plantation, the root or the conjure doctor did both of these things and more, and therefore played a prestigious role amongst the slave or the enslaved community. Since Black people received inadequate health care from their owners who lacked medical knowledge, they had to take their medical care into their own hands. Many also preferred to their own healers and conjurers over the other physicians, who used them as degrading experimental projects that usually ended in death. An increase of healers, midwives, and conjurers continued past antebellum. Since segregation gave Black people the worst received treatments. Congregation in the slaved or enslaved community was also used frequently to resist against the colonist and the slaver and to solve any internal conflicts. Misconception number 2. Hoodoo and voodoo are the same. Nope. Negative. Voodoo is a vadoon, is an African traditional religion that requires initiation, while hoodoo is a practice with origins in the southern Black Belt. It emerged from enslaved Africans, retaining and compounding their African traditional religions from the brutal institutions of American slavery that threatened their culture. But of course, there were some cultural exchanges between the Europeans, those usually that were Protestants, and also some of the indigenous folkways. Through enslavement, they became significant to developing hoodoo. But what is often left out of most of this discourse is that the major components of hoodoo is credited to the composition of spiritual and cultural beliefs and practices of African ethnic groups that stretches from areas what is now known as Senegal, the coast of West Africa, down to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Hoodoo is mostly Congo, brought over by enslaved Africans through the Middle Passage. And at the end of the Civil War, only 15% of African Americans were in fact Christian. The majority practiced hoodoo, and even after it took white and Black Christians to move Black people into the church, most modified it for their needs to keep African traditions alive. For example, Psalms. Psalms is actually famously used as a book of incantations to shape preserved conditions. You can also look into the sacred dance that is the ring shout, likely derived from the diagram of the Congo cosmogram, which is still practiced in its modern form today in Black churches. There became aspects of Protestant Christianity that are seemingly familiar with African cultural traditions, such as the cross vibrating with the Congo Waiwa cosmogram, and the visible themes in the Old and New Testament resonating with the themes of African practices, such as animal sacrifices and ritual water immersions, etc., that went well with the process of hoodoo. Overall, parts of Christianity became indispensable, modified, but since hoodoo adapts depending on our conditions, we are free to replace parts of Christianity to practice hoodoo. Hoodoo, in fact, it's its own non-Western spiritual and cultural practice and needs to be seen as such. Another misconception: hoodoo is a practice open to everyone. Incorrect. Hoodoo is a closed practice that does not require initiation. Notice that people think that the orishas are part of hoodoo, and that is false. If you are not initiated into Ifa or Santeria or Lukumi, please refrain from saying you are the daughter, son, child of an Orisha. These are not pagan gods. Use whichever way you will. You have to be called and initiated into the practice. And like with other closed but not initiative African traditional religions, hoodoo can be practiced by any Black person across the diaspora, but mainly African Americans because of a generational connection. If you are not an African American, you should be encouraged to look into your own African traditional religions from that territory, for you'll have more connections to that. And finally, due to the common appropriations and the commercialism of hoodoo, mainly done by white people, there is only a few ways to learn about its traditions. One is by receiving informal training and information from ancestors, family members, or the community. Many of our knowledge is handed down orally through generation to generation and not written down. This is mainly one of the reasons why non-Blacks cannot practice hoodoo, because no ancestry and the lack of the connection to the cultural complex. The other way is to commit yourself to immense studying and research. Don't read any books from a different type of some people that misappropriated our things or their enablers. A conjurer is traditionally self-taught or cooperates with the spirit and the ancestors for divine knowledge and wisdom, and that connects them to human life, nature, and the community. Ashe, Ashe. Let's explore some of the things that you don't even know that are considered sacred in hoodoo. Black skin, sweet grass, and tobacco. The use of white sage has become very controversial in the last decade. It should have been controversial a lot sooner than that. With our quest to decolonize our soul, they, ironically, often run in a circle of capitalism, buying up and using up whatever it is most easily available on the free market. Many spiritualists taken over use white sage as one of the materials that can be found anywhere especially on Amazon and TJ Maxx, is everywhere, which isn't a good thing. When people accept that the commodities and the consumption makes most readily available, they become complicit in the marketeering of the indigenous spiritual goods, being caught up in the fake convenience of capitalism causes people to overlook tools that will have the most cultural integrity within their practice. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because white sage should be cultivated in a way, especially through indigenous people, which is primarily known for, should be when you harvest white sage, when you take it from the earth, you have to replace it with something into the earth. That way it becomes sacred. And some of the root workers of Hoodoo are moving away from this capitalistic situation, especially when it comes to plants that are some use to us in spiritual botanicals. Our personal relationships with the divine forces of nature are paramount to root workers. And these relationships cannot be packaged and sold. So when you go and get your herbs, make sure that it's sustainable. Look at how it's harvested before you purchase. I know some of us can't go into our local areas and gain the things that we need. But if you're going to purchase things offline, make sure you know who you're buying from. And make sure that there isn't a middleman benefiting from that, if you can. Sometimes only fresh plants will do if we happen to do some things, and that's no exception. We let the plants tell us how they wish us to work with them. More importantly, we first allow the plants to choose us and not the other way around. So what's a Black person new to Hoodoo to do? Look around. Learn about what your ancestors used based upon where they were located. Cedar, tobacco, sweetgrass, and white sage are sacred directions for indigenous Turtle Islanders or Native Americans. For spiritual reasons and for the fact that you'll find cedar in the north, tobacco in the east, sweetgrass in the south, and white sage in the west. There is a reason why cedar, tobacco, and sweetgrass is also for use in Hoodoo and by African descendants. When people talk about the indigenous people influence in conjure or Hoodoo, most people assume that to mean that we absorb native lore and their rituals. That's not always the case. Although there is some intertwining or intermingling of the African and Native struggle in the community, the base of the indigenous American influence in conjure comes from the land, the flora, the fauna of this land, especially since many Africans were trafficked to the Americans already and had herbal knowledge that could translate across continents. As African people, we brought over African practices and learned how to adapt to indigenous American ecologies and environments. Many were skilled and knowledgeable herbalists whose expertise could translate over to new land. Even in colonial world that we lived in, the intelligence and the languages of this land was made available to us via the marriage of the land with our experiences, our blood, our tears, and our prayers that met this soil. Our knowledge of plants carried over with us. We were able to make intelligent workings with roots without much hands-on guidance from the indigenous. In the times when connections with the indigenous were not fostered, and some things were learned through trial and error. There were times of a cultural exchange, and even times when African and some indigenous people shared the Black or the Negro label due to skin color, and the intentional mislabeling of indigenous people, depending on the area and the political happenings. That cultural exchange between those of African ancestry and indigenous ancestry is not always universal amongst some of our ancestral Hoodoo practitioners. And while adapting African practices, often by forced environment, and the experiences during the enslavement, we absorbed these sacred directions. Sweetgrass in the south, the Gullah Geechee of the Carolinas and North Georgia coastal areas and islands had extensive history and the relationship with sweetgrass. One of the most outwardly visible usages of sweetgrass by the Gullah Geechee folk is evident in the baskets that they wove. Sweetgrass is often used to sweeten after a cleansing, to recall benevolent energies back into a space. What about those cedars in the north? Cedar is often found historically in Black cemeteries. Black cemeteries are, let's say, after death, examples of how systemic anti-Blackness and restriction from resources affected even the dead. In Black cemeteries, you'll find places where cedar trees were sometimes used as grave markings. Cedar is another sacred direction, which is the direction of the East, that our ancestors built a relationship with. They can be used to extract oil. Cedar is a powerful cleanser, and it can be used to draw spirits when used with other materials. I'm sorry, cedar in the north. In the east came the tobacco plant. One shouldn't have to be told the hows and whys tobacco came to be absorbed as a sacred spiritual tool for Africans. Enslavement is the short answer. Enslaved Black people worked with the plant. They were forced to. And during that work, they built an undeniable relationship with tobacco. For African Americans that have ancestral lineages from enslaved people that were based in Maryland and Virginia areas, tobacco is especially sacred for those ancestral spirits. Tobacco is a favorite of ancestral spirits across the diaspora. But many African Americans will have some link to the Chesapeake area, as that is not only where chattel slavery started in the United States and in the English colonies, but white human traffickers or slave traders based in the Chesapeake area are responsible for trafficking some of the highest numbers of Africans to this land and dispersing them across the colonies. One could argue that there is not enough history with Black people that are not indigenous. Apologies. That often happens, Things just start turning on for no reason. But I digress. While some of our culture use white sage, most Black people that used it do so because of the commercial availability of it. It's a part of what they call spiritual capitalism. And while there are some Black people that use the white sage and it's within its cultural integrity, you'll notice that the usage is concentrated on the West Coast, where the white sage originates. For people that use local materials, there are Black people whose ancestors did expand to the West, expanded prior to the Great Migration. But many of the same people that use white sage appropriately, not as a result of commercial marketeering of that sacred plant, have native ancestry. Although Black people did not expand to the West both prior to and after the Great Migration, the majority of our ancestors, the spoken word, the griot, and the experience are concentrated within the eastern and southern areas of the United States. The reason why people advise against using commercial white sage is to the respect, to the integrity of the indigenous tradition. Advocacy for non-Native American people to sway away from white sage is an indigenous. African Black people are indigenous too. Political stance. And all against white spiritual colonization, consumption, and consumerism. There have been some heinous occurrences that have already attempted to ravish and flatten Hoodoo. Many worry that moving away from the commercial white sage limits their spiritual practice. However, it liberates the practitioners from being captive in the wheel of capitalism and cultural ineffectiveness. But in turn, this encourages practitioners to sharpen their knowledge of their local flora and fauna, creating a spiritual practice that is ecologically sound and ancestrally aligned. The foundation of Hoodoo is concerned about the wellness of the earth, and the politics that's affecting its people, and redirecting our usage of sacred plants is in line with the values of this tradition. Am I saying that you shouldn't use it? Do as you will. But what I have noticed the shift in is that most practitioners are growing their own. So that way it is harvested the right way. But like I said, if you have no choice but to purchase these items, make sure you are purchasing them correctly and that they are wildly harvested, and by whom. Ashe. Cedar tobacco and sweetgrass have a prominent and long founded place in Hoodoo or contra culture as an African diasporic tradition religion. So please use it wisely. I want to thank you for stopping by Blended Healing. I know that this was a lot of information, but it's something that needs to be talked about. The value of Hoodoo and the movement back to basics. When you get in time to dissect this information, I hope you can utilize it to your benefit. Once again, thank you for coming through Blended Healing. Ashe and deep bow to each and every one of you. Be well.
You see the bad in me, not the good in me. You think you know me all too well, but I can guarantee I'm not what you think. But I don't feel I need to prove myself. So you can't think what you think, just think what you think now. Think on. And I'm gonna do what I do. If you don't wanna learn me, then move on. Try a little tenderness, and don't be too quick to judge. If you take the time to just call my phone, you might find some love. How could you even know what's inside my head? Yes, people gon' talk about the things they don't understand. So you can't think what you think, just think what you think now. Think on. And I'm gon' do what I do. If you don't wanna learn me, then move on. You can't think what you think, just think what you think now. And I'm gonna do what I do. If you don't wanna learn me, then move on. Don't get caught up in your feelings, 'cause people have opinions too. They may try to turn your world upside down, but you gotta keep a smile. Try a little tenderness,